The European vacation of May 1967 was less of a leisurely stroll through history and more of a motorized sprint, according to travel diaries from the time, famously capturing the frantic pace of the Globus tour group, nicknamed Speedy Gonzales. You can almost feel the vibration of the bus windows as it rumbled through mountain passes, crossing 3 borders in as many days, while high society yachts like the Christina O sat bobbing in the harbor of Monte Carlo. This specific itinerary from May 25th to May 27th, 1967, serves as a time capsule for the golden age of coach touring, a period when seeing Europe meant waking up before the sun to beat the crowds at the Italian border. It was truly a relentless pace. When you look at the geography, they started the day in Italy, near the birthplace of Giacomo Puccini, Torre del Lago, and ended it in Monaco. That drive is iconic but grueling. You are essentially tracing the Ligurian coast, passing through places like Rapallo and Nice, all while navigating these narrow, winding roads that the diarists described as feeling like a rocking cradle. It was enough to make anyone sleepy, but the payoff was that first glimpse of the Mediterranean, which on that particular Corpus Christi day was rough and windy. There is a funny irony in the diary entry about the bathtub incident, where the traveler accidentally turned on the wrong faucet. It highlights that even in these grand hotels, the technology of the 1960s could be a bit counterintuitive. But moving past the bathroom mishaps, they mentioned passing through Viterbo and Santa Rosa. That city is fascinating because it's known as the City of Popes. During the 13th century, it was actually the papal seat for about 24 years, which is why there's that mention of 2 popes staying there. It wasn't just a rest stop, it was a place where history was literally layered into the stone. Viterbo is heavy with that medieval gravity, but the tour didn't linger. They were on their way to Monte Carlo, wondering if they would see Princess Grace. It's easy to forget that in 1967, Grace Kelly had only been the Princess of Monaco for about 11 years. She was the ultimate fairy tale for American tourists. And while they didn't mention a royal sighting, they did spot the Christina O in the harbor. That yacht was the absolute peak of 1960s opulence. Owned by Aristotle Onassis, it was originally a Canadian warship, the HMCS Stormont, which he bought for scrap value and spent $4 million, an astronomical sum then, to renovate. The details of that yacht are legendary, like the swimming pool with the mosaic floor that could rise up to become a dance floor. Seeing it in the harbor must have made the budget bus tour feel even more like a whirlwind. But then they reached Nice, and the diary mentions the Hotel Negresco. Even today, if you walk the Promenade des Anglais, the Negresco is the crown jewel with its pink dome. In the mid-60s, it was under the direction of Jean Augier, who turned it into a literal museum hotel. It hosted everyone from Salvador Dali to the Beatles. Jean Augier's story is incredible. She actually took over the hotel because it was one of the few buildings in Nice with a lift large enough to accommodate her mother's bed after she became paralyzed. The diary mentions the traveler wanted to stay there someday, which is a sentiment shared by almost every tourist who sees that white facade. Instead, they had escargot at a place called Le Nautique and took a bus ride that they described as delightful, watching the Côte d'Azur light up at night. It's a very specific kind of 1960s romanticism, the glow of the Riviera reflecting off the Mediterranean while you hunt for friends in a sea of luxury hotels. The pace didn't slow down the next day. By May 27th, they were already heading toward Geneva. That trip through the French Alps sounds harrowing. They described it as a hair-raising trip through actual clouds. They mentioned the lavender fields and the Dauphine region. Now, usually lavender in Provence doesn't hit peak bloom until late June or July, so seeing lavender in late May suggests either a very early season or they were seeing the early greening of the fields that looked like a carpet of color against the alpine backdrop. And then they stop in Sisteron. It's often called the gateway to Provence because it sits right in a gap between 2 mountain ridges. The traveler noted the people there seemed to know nothing of the outside world. A blacksmith, pastures, and fresh French bread. It's a sharp contrast to the glitz of Monte Carlo they left just hours before. One moment you're looking at the world's most expensive yacht, and the next you're eating fresh cherries and eclairs in a medieval square that feels like it hasn't changed since the time of Napoleon. That juxtaposition is exactly why these tours were so popular despite the exhaustion. You have these massive cultural shifts in a single afternoon. They mention a woman named Jen who supposedly smelled up the bus with hairspray. It's those human details that make the 1,500-mile journey real. By the time they reached Geneva, they were exhausted, but finally had a comfortable room with a bath. They even had local white wine with their Chinese friends, showing that these tours were these little microcosms of global interaction, even back in '67.
It's also worth noting the technical aspect of the drive. The roads they were on, particularly the ones leading out of Italy and through the Alps, were not the modern highways we have today. The autostrada system in Italy was expanding, but many of these mountain passes were still the old winding routes. When they mention the rocking cradle effect of the tires, that's a literal description of the suspension on those mid-century coaches navigating switchbacks. It was a physically taxing way to see the world, but it gave them a perspective on the landscape that you just don't get at 80 miles per hour on a modern interstate.
Let's talk about that stop at the Kon-Tiki Hotel. The 1960s were the height of the tiki craze, inspired by Thor Heyerdahl's expedition. Even in the middle of the Italian mountains, you had hotels capitalizing on that South Pacific aesthetic. It shows how pervasive that specific cultural trend was. You're in the Ligurian Alps, but you're drinking cappuccino in a place named after a Polynesian raft. It's bizarre, but perfectly representative of the era's kitsch.
It really was a blend of everything. You had the high culture of Puccini's birthplace, where the master composed many of his greatest works like Tosca and Madama Butterfly, and the low-stakes fun of playing a slot machine across from a bowling alley in Monte Carlo. The travelers were trying to see the entire spectrum of European life in a week. They even mentioned Rapallo, where Empress Elizabeth of Austria, the famous Sissi, used to stay. Sissi was a figure of immense tragic glamour, much like Princess Grace would become, and it's interesting how the travelers were subconsciously looking for these icons of royalty throughout the trip.
It's as if they were chasing the ghosts of the old European aristocracy while riding in the vehicle of the new middle-class tourism. The diary mentions the Tsar of Russia coming to the Riviera before World War I, and then immediately pivots to having a beer and going to bed. The grand history is there, but the reality of the 7 a.m. departure time is the thing that truly dictates their lives. The Speedy Gonzales nickname was no joke. Globus was known for its efficiency, sometimes at the expense of relaxation.
But that efficiency is what allowed them to see the two destroyers lit up in the Monte Carlo harbor and then be in the French Alps by lunch the next day. They mentioned Cisteron again, specifically the cherries and eclairs. That's a very French moment. Buying snacks for a long bus ride through the mountains. You can almost see them huddled on the bus, passing around pastries as they cross the border into Switzerland, leaving the lavender and the heat of the Riviera for the snow-capped Dauphine Mountains.
Geneva was the finish line for this segment, and it seems like the most functional part of the trip. A good room, a bath, a walk with friends. It's the quiet after the storm. When you look at the total distance covered from Lake Bolsena up to Geneva, it's hundreds of miles of the most challenging terrain in Europe. To do that in a few days while still finding time to wade in the ice-cold Mediterranean or visit a blacksmith in a hidden village is a testament to the sheer ambition of 1960s travel.
It also reminds us that travel hasn't always been about the destination. The drive through actual clouds, the rocking of the bus, the hair-raising mountain turns. Those were the experiences. The destination was just where you slept. The real story was the transition from the sun-drenched Italian Riviera to the crisp alpine air of Switzerland, all seen through the window of a coach that never seemed to stop moving.
It's a fascinating look at how we once consumed the world in giant, breathless gulps. The diarists captured a moment where the world was shrinking, but the mountains were still dangerous, and the Mediterranean was still vast and unpredictable. If you enjoyed this journey through 1967, share this episode with someone who loves a good vintage travel story.